Hello, in today's video I want to analyze the movie 300 and I want to look at the ideology behind it. I'm not that interested in whether or not the battle scenes were historically accurate or not. There are many other YouTube videos about it. For example, the Metatron video. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But I want to uh, talk about the main premise of the movie and analyze it. The movie ends with the Spartan narrator telling us that the victory of the Spartans is essentially a victory of Western civilization and rationalism and freedom and democracy over the Eastern tyranny and despotism and mysticism. And it glorifies that victory and portrays it in this good versus evil sense, where Sparta stands for democracy and reason, and the Persians stand for decadence, tyranny, and absolutism. But I want to also suggest an alternative way of looking at the movie that would actually make the movie much deeper and better. So if the movie, without irony and non-critically, presents us this thesis that Sparta is freedom and the Persians are tyranny, then the movie from historical perspective isn't really that good. It's inaccurate, and one could also say that the movie is kind of maybe even could be seen as xenophobic or hateful towards the Iranians, and many Iranians in fact were offended by the movie. But there is another way of looking at the movie, and that is that the movie tells us the myths that the Spartans had about themselves. And that, I think, is the case, and I'm going to try and defend that thesis. And I actually got this idea by watching the Metatron video, where he tells us that Spartans, in fact, didn't fight naked without without armor on their body. And in fact, we have data that indicates that some Spartan soldiers were punished for fighting without body armor, but on their own art, the Spartans depicted themselves fighting naked, and that's where it kind of hit me. Well, maybe the movie portrays Spartans as they saw themselves, and in that case, the movie is actually much deeper than it seems. Um, and okay, first I want to tell you something about the old movie, the 300 Spartans, that inspired Frank Miller and ultimately Zack Snyder, that adapted his graphic novel. So the old movie, the 300 Spartans, was made during the Cold War. And most film critics at the time saw the movie as a reflection of the Cold War, and the movie is essentially about the Europeans defending their soil from Asian despotism and tyranny. And if you take into account the context, that is the Cold War, that Asian despotism and tyranny is Soviet communism, and that's why many people at the time saw the original movie as a metaphor for liberalism versus communism. But this new movie, since it happened after the war in Iraq and after the United States and Iran began to essentially to have an economic war, many saw it as a justification of Western imperialism. And the Iranian government even protested against the movie, as you can see here, in a letter to the UN. And yeah, they seem to think that the movie promotes hatred, war, and arrogance. And their argument is that since the movie is historically inaccurate in its premise that Sparta equals freedom and Persia equals tyranny, that therefore movie is hateful. And well, I would even agree with it if it wasn't for this alternative hypothesis, and that is that the movie is telling us the myth that the Spartans themselves believed about themselves. Um, But okay, let me first try and be the devil's advocate and essentially explain why one could make the case that Sparta is freedom and Persia is Eastern despotism. Well, a very primitive form of democracy actually did, in fact, exist in Sparta. So they had two kings, but their power was limited by the five ephors, and the ephors were elected by the people, by the free citizens of Sparta. And when I say the free citizens, that is roughly speaking somewhere around 25 to 30% of Sparta, but because most people in Sparta were actually those without the right to vote, and the most numerous castes were the helots, something like slaves, but they're actually something in between slaves and serfs. And their position was truly not good. They could be even killed by free citizens without any punishment for the free citizens, which even the Old Testament actually tells us. The laws of Moses tell us that free people shouldn't just kill slaves for no reason, and there is at least a financial punishment or some sort of punishment for such behavior. In fact, in the Old Testament, but here, as a free citizen, you could essentially kill a helot. And yeah, Sparta was a very militaristic society in many ways. From our liberal perspective today, it wasn't a free democratic society. It remains questionable whether or not the Spartans actually killed their babies that were weak and deformed. Plutarch tells us so, but again, we are not sure that that's the case, because ancient historians often just lied. But yeah, the argument could be, well, the Spartans, at least they had the ephors, and the king wasn't allowed to declare war without the ephors or without the council of the elders approving it. And some primitive form of democracy is present here in the Spartan society, while on the other hand, the Persians are an absolute monarchy. The first Persian Empire is the absolute monarchy. And again, the movie also tells us that the Spartans, they stand for reason and logic, while Persia stands for mysticism. But I would argue that the movie, in a clever way, argues against itself. There is that cool scene where the storm and lightning hits Persian ships, and the narrator tells us Zeus is punishing our enemies, and therefore we see that the Spartans are just as religious and just as superstitious as their enemies. The Spartan soldiers see it as Zeus helping them, while kind of metal music is playing in the background. That is a really cool scene in the movie. And one of the important plot points is the fact that that Leonidas wasn't allowed to take his entire military because of the holy days in a year when Spartans aren't allowed to wage war, which is in fact why they weren't present at the Marathon battle, in which the Athenians won against Darius, the father of Xerxes. And yeah, so we can see that in many ways Spartan society was irrational, just as irrational as Persian theocracy. And here we can see how the Spartans portray themselves. Here you can see they portray themselves as fighting naked, just as we can see in the movie. But yeah, and let me also just say something about this idea that that had the Persians won, that this Western empiricism and rationality would be lost, or that it would never have emerged in the West with Persia winning. Well, I don't think why we should believe it, because Persian Empire was specific in so far as they allowed a lot of autonomy to their subjects, and ultimately all that would have changed is that Sparta and other Greek city-states would have to pay tribute to to the Persian ruler, and that's pretty much all that would have changed. Aristotle would probably still find his philosophy of empiricism, and Plato would still write his famous works, but just this time under the Persian Empire. And the Persians were actually, from our liberal perspective today, very tolerant, and they allowed the local people to keep their religions and their customs. And and yeah, what I also want to mention is some movie critics also point out the fact that Spartan ideology is in many ways similar to Hitler, and that Hitler admired the Spartans and their alleged eugenics, that they killed weak children allegedly, but they use it as an argument that actually Spartans were the bad guys because Hitler admired them. But to me that's not a good argument, because I mean, the fact that Hitler admired them, it just makes Hitler crazy. It doesn't make them bad. I mean, Hitler is a guy that takes this relatively progressive country, Germany, and then he descends it into the darkness of the ancient times with his politics and ideology. But Spartans, I mean, Spartans, this idea that weak children should be killed, it really isn't that dark. And I mean, for if we are talking about the 500 years before Christ, that idea isn't really that evil in the ancient context. So we also shouldn't go too far in the other direction and say, well, no, actually the Greeks were the evil ones. Well, no, it's just two ancient entities fighting each other on the battlefield. Both are, from our perspective today, kind of evil and irrational. And what also needs to be said is, well, yeah, of course that Leonidas and the Spartans see themselves as fighting for freedom. Every civilization sees themselves as, we are the good guys, we are pro-freedom, our enemies, they're tyrants, they're irrational, they're inferior. That's how that's how logic of the ancient time actually worked, and even today it's not that different. And here you can see just how huge the Persian Empire was, and you don't get to have such a huge empire just by being cruel, and just by kind of being irrational and primitive and barbaric. I mean, from the Greek perspective, all the non-Greeks were essentially barbarians. And what also needs to be mentioned is that the first Persian Empire was in many ways more tolerant than an average empire of the time. For example, the Persians, after conquering the Babylonian kingdom, they set the Jews free from the Babylonian slavery, and here they are shown to be more tolerant than actually the Babylonians, and they are definitely more tolerant than the Jews themselves, if we are to believe the Old Testament and their conquest of the Promised Land. And yeah, here we can see that that Persian society was very much a theocracy. Yeah, here it stands that Ahura Mazda gave the power to Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, son of Darius. And yeah, here we can see he's a king of countries with different kinds of men, so some form of tolerance is present. And you can see that they had magnificent architecture at the time, the Persians, so they weren't just barbarians. You can see this is the gate of the people that celebrates this relative tolerance that existed in the Persian Empire of the time. And okay, I mean, I just have to explain, when I say tolerance, this tolerance isn't born out of this liberal notion that all men are created equal. This tolerance is simply a pragmatic tolerance. It is a tolerance that the Mongols had for different religions. And here you can see Mongols fighting against the Hungarian knights. But yeah, the Mongols were also tolerant when compared to, let's say, the Islamic Caliphate or the Crusaders, because they allowed different religions to worship their gods. And Genghis Khan even pragmatically asked all religious priests to pray to their own gods for his victory. So yeah, in the Persian Empire, in the same way, there is this pragmatic form of tolerance that existed. And that's why this idea that Persians are the barbarians is, well, it's definitely not true, but my thesis is that the movie is actually aware of it. And okay, one could actually make the case that the Greeks were still the more rational ones, because they had people like Pythagoras, and Pythagoras went on to inspire Plato and other great thinkers that changed the world. But what also needs to be mentioned is that according to some historians, Pythagoras actually studied with the Persian priests, and he was inspired by their mathematics and philosophy in discovering his most famous mathematical theorem. And Pythagoras was also the first human that claimed that all relationships within the universe can be described by numbers, and that is why he's seen as the father of modern mathematics. But it is very much possible that he was actually inspired by the Persian priests, the Magi, while he was in Egypt. I believe he encountered them. So yeah, my point is that there are good arguments to be made for both sides, to show that both sides were actually very progressive in a way, and that they were actually the rational ones and the good ones. But in reality, it is just two ancient entities fighting each other, and like picking the good side is just projection. It's just us applying our modern ideology to ancient times. And I actually believe that the movie is aware of it, or at least I hope that the movie is actually aware of it, that it is silly to apply our modern notions of freedom and democracy versus tyranny on ancient times, especially because Persian Empire was very tolerant for its time when compared to Babylonians or Jews, for example, the Jewish kingdom, for example. But yeah, so my thesis is actually that the movie 300 tells us the myth that the Spartans had about themselves, and in that way I would argue the movie actually isn't hateful or xenophobic or anything like that. It simply tells us the myth that they had about themselves.